Why I love being a fan. Hello and welcome to this week's video. Now this week I wanted to do something a little bit different. I want to talk about being a fan, what it means to be a fan, and how it's a part of who you are. Now I sometimes wonder if in fact I'm pretty certain that part of being a fan is a slightly obsessive quality. I certainly have that slightly obsessive quality within myself. But I think in general that it's a good thing because it does make you appreciate things in perhaps a deeper way than you would otherwise. Certainly I've been a fan and I've had fan tendencies since I was a kid. And honestly, being a fan is not something that you do. It's part of who you are. Now, I'm not just talking about, say, Doctor Who. I'm talking about being a fan of things in general and how that's a part of my personality. And I think most fans' personalities. Now, one of the earliest kind of fan obsessive things that I can remember doing was before Doctor Who. It was sometime in the early-ish 80s, mid-ish 80s, when I was a fan of the American comedy series Soap. Now, I remember becoming absolutely obsessed with the Who Killed Peter Campbell storyline in season 1. And I remember filling a textbook trying to figure out who did it, who the killer was. Unfortunately, I don't still have that textbook. I wish I did, because I imagine it would come across as being completely lunatic. I can't remember exactly what I was doing. I have a feeling it was a sort of elaborate text-based version of Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. That was how scientific it was. You know, it wasn't about character and motive and things like that. I think it was a sort of an elaborate version of going through all the characters and knocking one out and then doing it again and knocking another one out. And hilariously, I actually got it right. I remember being absolutely chuffed beyond words when I actually got the identity of the killer absolutely right, even though, like I said, the way I got there was about as unscientific and illogical as you could possibly imagine. But it still made me very happy as a, I don't know, 8, 9, 10-year-old, whatever I was at that point. Being a fan, of course, you know more things than the average person. Now, I can remember having a right argument with a school friend as a kid about Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, because, as I've said before, my brother collected movie magazines, and I read those movie magazines, and because of that, I knew that Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was actually a prequel to Raiders of the Lost Ark. But I had a school friend, I think his name was Gavin, who just would not have this. He would not accept this, that it was set before Raiders and not after it. And I remember having one hell of an argument one afternoon because I knew I was freaking right, because I'd read the freaking magazine and read Steven Spielberg and Harrison Ford talking about it. But he just wouldn't have it. Now, it was in the mid-80s, of course, the mid-late 80s, that I became a fan of Doctor Who, which was one of the, I guess that was the first time that I became a conscious fan. You know, I mean, I don't think I even heard that word prior to that until I became a Doctor Who fan, and I started reading about Doctor Who and learning about Doctor Who, whether things like a Celebration and later on Doctor Who magazine in late 1987 when I found that. I think that was the first time I'd ever kind of put a word to the idea of what being a fan was. And of course, I mean, it's fair to say that did change my life to a degree. It certainly became a huge part of my life, particularly at that time, but I mean, it still is. I mean, I'm still a Doctor Who fan. It's not the only thing I'm a fan of. I'm a fan of lots of things, but that's certainly kind of pushed me into having fandoms, I guess, rather than just like having a favorite show or a favorite movie, into having actual fandoms. And I mean, it's affected my life, but in mostly positive ways for the most part. I mean, when I was in school, my English teacher knew that I was a Doctor Who fan, and she kept pushing me to join our school's sci-fi club. Now, you know, I was a bit of an introvert. I'm not. I still am. I'm not really a joiner. You know, I mean, if I go to a party, I'm the guy in the corner making sarcastic comments about everybody else. So I wasn't much of a joiner, but in the end, I kind of joined, and that was, you know, because of that, I made some really great friends, and I actually got involved in making like fan videos, fan kind of Doctor Who adventure videos. You know, like it wasn't actually Doctor Who; it was called something else. It was sort of like a spoof of Doctor Who and Star Trek and genre stuff in general, and I was one of the actors in it. I went from a fairly small part in the first one to one of the main kind of people that was doing it, in the lead roles. We did 4 of them. I think the last one was 1991, literally. And this is how important that was to me. 1991, of course, we emigrated to Australia, and we emigrated in late July. Now, we could actually have left like a month earlier, because once I'd done all my exams and that, we could have just gone then. But there was no way that was going to happen, because we were doing another of these videos a month later across a full week that it took to make them. And there was no way I was missing the last one. There was no way. So I literally forced my parents to put off emigrating for another month so that I could do that last one. And I mean, that's still one of my fondest memories. But of course, there's lots of things that I'm a fan of, and there's lots of moments. Not necessarily life-changing, dramatic moments, but just small moments that you just kind of remember that you went to a certain degree because of that you're a fan. I can remember, this would have been a couple of months before we emigrated in 1991. I can remember watching Press Gang Season 3 in that year, and the previous week had been part 1 of a 2-part story. It was the Gun Siege 2-parter, which is a really dramatic story. And I can remember the following week, I think we were doing exams at this point, and we did an exam, and my parents were supposed to pick me up, and because I lived a fair way away from school, and they didn't show up. And I'm like, I'm going to miss Press Gang. I'm going to miss part 2. I actually started walking home. It was like a couple of miles. And I actually started walking home because there's no way I'm waiting. I'm going to miss Press Gang. Thankfully, they picked me up on their way home. And I can remember, I was at some kind of university thing in 1999. I'm skipping ahead, I know. By that point, I was a big fan of Buffy, and pretty much the only thing I can remember about that year, I remember being in a philosophy, because they were showing Buffy fairly regularly at this point. They'd messed around with it, Channel 7 over here, for a long time, and then they were finally showing it fairly regularly, albeit at like 10:30 at night. So I usually taped it and watched it the next day. And pretty much the only thing I can remember about that whole year that I was at that university is sitting in a philosophy tube, bored out of my mind, thinking, I want to go home and watch Buffy. That's pretty much the only thing I can remember from that experience. And I still use that quote Whenever I'm bored, I always think, I want to go home and watch Buffy. But it's interesting how fandoms can follow you for so long, and how finding something new or finding something unexpected or finding something that you've never seen before can really, can really make you feel great. It can be really inspiring and life affirming. Now, I remember, I think I've said this before during one of the memorabilia videos. Back in the early 90s with Neighbours, I was a huge fan of Amelia Frid, who played the original Cody in Neighbours. Now, because we emigrated, and because we emigrated at a time where the UK was like a full year behind Australia in terms of transmission, I literally missed an entire year of that show. And of course, being my luck, it was an entire year with who was then my favourite character. And I literally arrived 2 days before she left the freaking show. And I mean, you have to know what it was like in the 90s. There was no freaking internet. There was no streaming. There was no way to find those episodes or even know what had happened in those episodes. You were basically screwed. That was it. And I can still remember how exciting it was in 2002, because they'd shown some repeats in the early to mid 90s, and then they took them off before they got to that point. Then they brought them back in 2000, and I can still remember how exciting it was in 2002 to actually get to that year that I had missed the first time. It was just amazing to actually finally get to see that stuff, I mean, even now, and I'm kind of more blasé about it now, but even now, when I watch that very first episode that I missed at the time, it still feels almost magical in a way, because it still feels so weird that I finally got to see it. I mean, even though good God, that's like 19 years ago now that happened, and it doesn't feel that long. It doesn't feel as long as it was between 91 and 2002. And that fandom led to some interesting things. I mean, for one thing, it was because of that I actually joined a Neighbours forum at the time, because I wanted to talk about that year, those episodes that I was seeing for the first time. I mean, at that point, I'd stopped watching the current show for 9 years, and I had no interest in that. But I wanted to talk about these episodes I was seeing for the first time. And it's kind of ironic, because it was because of that like a year or 18 months or so later, I started hearing things about the current show, like the fact that they'd brought back David Bishop as a regular character and played by the same guy that had played him for like a month in 1988, which is fairly remarkable by Neighbours standards, to keep the same actor. And the fact that they'd brought in Skye as a teenager when we'd last seen her as a toddler back in the early 90s. I started hearing things that made me curious enough to eventually tune in. And of course, I started watching it again. And because of that, of course, I became a fan of Bridget Novell. I became a fan of Wicked Science. And it's like how all these things kind of, one fandom runs into another, because it happened to happen at just the right time for that to coalesce together. Of course, the other interesting thing about that fandom was, I don't think I've said this before, I actually got to interview Amelia for a Neighbours fan site, and I may tell you that story more in full at a later date. That was different. But I just remember, there's so many moments in your life that you remember, and you know when it was, you know the year it was, because of this association. I have stronger memories of like fan-linked things than I do the majority of stuff that's happened in actual real life. I don't know if that's just me. Am I revealing too much here? Probably. But I mean, I can remember being at a university in a different one in 2003 or 2004, when we first heard that Doctor Who was coming back. Now, I can specifically remember, this was probably 2004, when they announced who the writers were going to be. Because, I mean, I had no idea who Russell T Davies was. I'd never heard of him, so that didn't do anything for me. But I remember kind of when they posted the list of writers, and there were names like Mark Gatiss and Paul Cornell, who of course I knew from the New Adventures books. And the one that got me really excited, of course, was Stephen Moffat, because Press Gang was and is still one of my favourite TV shows of all time. So hearing that he was going to be writing for New Who, that was a tremendously exciting moment. And of course, I mean, YouTube. I've been doing YouTube now for 13 and a half years, since early 2008. And of course, the reason that I'm doing that is that I'm a fan. And not just a fan of Doctor Who or one thing or another, but a fan of various things. And it was fanishness that ultimately kind of led to me, discovering YouTube, discovering fan music videos, and eventually kind of deciding to start doing them myself. I think it was 2005 before I even saw a fan music video for the first time. I mean, I didn't even know what the concept was. A fan music video? What's that? And somebody actually sent me one, and again, it was a neighbours one. It was an Amelia one, and I'd never seen a fan music video. Again, what is this thing? And I thought it was really cool. I don't. When did YouTube start? I think was it 2006? Because I think it was a certain point in 2006 that I joined. Because I didn't join immediately. Because I mean, I'm not a joiner. I'm not one who jumps on the latest fads and the latest trends and all that sort of thing. I only get onto something that's new if I can see how it's going to be relevant to me. And I remember, I think the very first YouTube video I ever clicked on, the very first time, was somebody that had found like a 30-second interview from Christmas '92 from the Panto that Amelia did in the UK. That was the first thing I'd seen on YouTube. And after that, of course, I discovered other fan music videos, like for Doctor Who and various movies and Buffy and stuff like that. And I kind of thought, oh, this is what YouTube is for, you know. And I started collecting. I mean, I've been collecting fan music videos. That's 15 years now, probably. Wow. And it was 18 months later that I started doing them myself. And it was another fandom that kind of provoked me into doing fan music videos for the first time. That was seeing Show Me Love again. I think that was... I'd seen it before, but I hadn't seen it for about 5 years or so, and I watched it again, and I absolutely loved it again. And that kind of inspired me to go off and make my first videos. Now, you know, hilariously, of course, I think my initial thing was I was going to do like half a dozen videos and leave it at that. You know, I was going to do a few music videos for some of my biggest fandoms, and then that was going to be it. Famous last words, you know, 13 and a half years later, yeah. And I'm still doing this. I mean, I love doing YouTube. It's certainly one of my favorite hobbies. I love doing it. And I love the fact that my channel has evolved and changed. And it's evolved and changed to kind of reflect both, you know, my fandoms. Because obviously, in that 13 and a half years, I've discovered new fandoms. I've rediscovered old ones. I mean, I became a fan of Emma Watson in 2011. That kind of got in there. The last 10 years, I've discovered stuff like Elementary, Person of Interest, or old stuff like Callan and Secret Army and that sort of stuff. And of course, last year I rediscovered, you know, the whole Bridget Novelle oeuvre, which I hadn't seen for 14 odd years because I hadn't had the foresight to tape it. I think with Wicked Science I thought it was going to get a DVD release, and it didn't, so then that was fucked. So I hadn't seen any of that for 14 years, and I rediscovered that last year, and that was fantastic. And I mean, this is what I mean by being a fan. You're not normal, are you? you're kind of weird, because I think when most people think about 2020, first thing that comes to their mind is probably, you know, the pandemic. Now, obviously, I think about the pandemic, but honestly, when I think about last year, the first thing that springs to my mind is the Bridget Novell Revival Fest, as I put it. And I mean, I love that. I love that I can do that with this channel as well. That if I do get a new fandom or something, I don't have to, you know, I don't have to change the channel completely, but at the same time, I can weave it in there with everything else, which I really like that. I think I'd go crazy if I just had to do one thing about one of my fandoms. I think I'd go nuts if I had to do that. I'd probably burned out years ago. But yeah, I love being a fan. I mean, I've only touched fairly lightly on some of the ways in which being a fan has affected my life and changed my life. But I think you get the general gist. It is a slightly obsessive quality, but I think, you know, so long as you keep it in perspective, it's kind of good. It's actually, generally speaking, it's been enriching and life-affirming and a joyous thing to be a fan of anything, really, of anything and everything that you can genuinely be passionate about and enthusiastic about and look forward to, and which, as I said, enriches your life and who you are. I mean, being a fan is not something that I do. It's who I am. I mean, I don't think there's a single day that goes by where I don't even think about one of my fandoms. Not necessarily very long, but I'm sure that, you know, during the course of the day, a thought will spring from somewhere about something that I'm a fan of. It probably helps, of course, that my media room's got tons of posters up and stuff like that, so you're kind of reminded of them, aren't you? But still, I think that being a fan has been a very, very positive thing for me, and that's why I love being a fan.